Hi, welcome to Peak Moment. I'm Janaia Donaldson, and my guest today, we're on location near Sebastopol, is Matt Stevens, who's a business consultant and a psychologist. And why we're talking to Matt is he's the chair of the Citizens Advisory Group for the town of Sebastopol. What group? What are you doing there?
The Citizens Advisory Group has been formed to study ways that Sebastopol, as a city government, can prepare for any either disruptions in energy supply to the city or dramatic increases in the price of energy, such that the city can become more prepared to meet its obligations to its citizens. Things like providing basic services, public safety, water, sewer.
How did you get involved in this group and in this area, this topic area?
Well, boy, I would say probably 4 or 5 years ago, I heard Richard Heinberg speak. He spoke in Sebastopol, and I wasn't really aware of peak oil as an issue. As soon as I heard him speak, it became quite clear that it was an important strategic issue. I do a lot of strategic planning in my business consulting, and I realized that this was an issue that was not on
anybody's radar.
Not
I'm
anybody's
sure.
radar screen.
Because when I first heard Richard, it was like my first thought was, surely the corporate world is not going to let everything take a nosedive because we're running out of it. I mean, surely there must be some contingency plans. And sounds like you were. Well, that's not true.
That's not true. The issue, I think, both in terms of government and the corporate world, is that their strategic planning horizon is 5 years at the most, and typically it's 2 to 3 years. And in reality, when an executive is thinking strategically, it's usually like next quarter.
Yes, sure, sure. So something that we've been thinking is sort of out there, decades away.
Right.
The energy stuff will be decades away, and somebody else in the energy world will take care of that.
Well,
sort of
well, also there is this pervasive sense that technology will provide a solution. Yes. I think that in the back of leaders' minds, at least the ones who are aware of energy as an issue, that someday, oil may become a finite resource. But there'll be an alternative, and hydrogen, is often thought of as an alternative. Electric cars, but frankly, none of those alternatives are either feasible or scalable to meet the energy demands that we face as a culture.
So, after hearing Heinberg, did that shift? Where did you go from there?
Talking with friends, basically. I have a group of men friends that we've known each other for, 30 years now. It's not really a men's group, but we hang out together and we do things together. And we were going to have a meeting about this because we felt, as men, and it's not because men are any more, capable or responsible than women, but we have, I think, a responsibility to be thinking about what we would do to help our community, to help our families, to become more prepared for events that could be related to energy disruptions. And so, we were going to have a meeting about it, and somebody on a local bulletin board posed the question, is anybody thinking about peak oil? And I responded yes, and the next thing you know, there was 30 or 40 people hitting me emails saying, can I participate? And I realized at that point that this was a bigger community issue, and so actually we started a group and had a series of meetings on the issue, and I started talking with Larry Robinson, who at the time was the mayor of Sebastopol, and he was already tuned into that, and he was planning on actually having a town hall meeting. And so he invited me to facilitate that, and we actually invited Richard Heinberg to come talk at this meeting, and then we had a community dialogue about, well, what does it mean to you? What should the community be doing or thinking about to prepare? What should the city be doing or thinking about to prepare? And one of the things that came out of that was the idea to create a citizens advisory group to look specifically at the city of Sebastopol, its energy utilization, its capabilities to respond to either disruptions or shortages or price increases when it comes to energy.
So you form, out of those discussions, out of those community discussions, you formed the group. How many are in your advisors?
There are 10 members in the group,
Okay.
and there's a process the city does for this kind of thing. This is not the first advisory group that's been formed by the city of Sebastopol. You apply for it, and they're looking for qualified people who have both the ability to, to think about the issues and to perform some kind of analysis, as well as work effectively with others.
Okay. So so that group just formed fairly recently? Or began?
It's been in existence for about 3 months now.
Oh, that's fairly recently.
Fairly
I would
recently.
think.
Our purpose, is to, sort of determine what needs to be analyzed first of all.
Okay.
And then create some recommendations on the basis of analysis of what Sebastopol should be doing.
So what are you looking at? So what are give me a sense of what the parameters you're looking at.
We're looking at water. We're looking at drinking
potable
water. Well, actually, the things that require electricity.
That the city provides.
Right. Electricity is big in the sense that, most of what the city provides depends on electricity in some fashion. And most of the electricity in California is produced through natural gas generators. And natural gas is peaking more or less along the same time frame and curve as oil is. And
which could be now. Could be, people think anywhere from now in the next few years, maybe. What's your sense?
There's a range. My sense is that we're about at peak now.
Okay.
I think that the oil-producing countries have significantly overestimated their reserves for, a variety of economic reasons. I think that probably plus or minus 2 or 3 years, probably at peak now.
Okay.
And the Association for the Study of Peak Oil, I think, is pegged it at 2007. So.
Well, that's close enough.
It's close.
So you're looking, since California's got natural gas, is where our method of generating electricity. You're looking at our vulnerability to that peak as well, then, because
there's an issue with electricity that, again, is not really on everybody's radar. It's on the grid's radar screen. The people that run the grid,
Okay.
their sense is that we're at capacity in terms of electrical production. Either importing it from, say, the Northwest, or generating it through the use of natural gas generation, and demand is continuing to increase. So the issue is, this year we'll have enough electricity, but next year that demand will begin to exceed the capacity, and there really isn't anywhere to grow the capacity right now. And the lead time for building either new generators or nuclear power plants is a very long lead time.
Long time.
And so demand is going to exceed capacity long before additional capacity is created. So what I'm hearing from the grid operators is that we could be seeing roving blackouts, not this August, but definitely by the following August.
Wow.
And so these are the kinds of issues that we're looking at for the city of Sebastopol. The water that they pump out of the ground runs on electricity. The pumps run on electricity. The sewage that has to be pumped out of Sebastopol to the regional sewage treatment facility requires electricity. So those kinds of things we're looking at. We're also looking at liquid petroleum use. The fire departments, police departments, the fleet of city vehicles for maintaining the city.
Gasoline
and diesel.
Right.
As well as the diesel power generators, that basically are the backup system for sewage and water.
Okay.
Yeah, and so we're looking
So you're looking
at
at sort of two strands then, really, of the electrical and the liquid fuel.
Those are the two basic ones,
big
right?
ones.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And then there's a secondary charge that we've received from the city, which is also to look at what the community can do to become more prepared. And the issue there is, there are certain things. There are things that a city's not really responsible for. For example, food. A city's not responsible for providing food.
Right.
In the Bay Area, there's only about 3 days of food supply in the grocery stores. They operate on what's called a just-in-time delivery system. And because food's perishable, even the non-perishable foods are distributed on a just-in-time basis.
Wow.
And so, after 3 days, say if the distribution stream was disrupted due to either disruptions in petroleum or even price increases, that could become an issue.
Yes,
And
yes.
I think personally that's probably a longer time frame issue than say the things that we could be expecting to see a year or two from now in terms of electricity and price increases for gasoline.
Right.
But
right.
so that we're actually looking at that kind of on a secondary basis. First we're focusing on sort of the jurisdictional responsibilities, and then we're going to focus on community responsibilities.
That's so. And what sort of in what time frame are you're both looking at what to analyze, which is what you're starting with now, and what the vulnerabilities are. So you're going to have to know how much petroleum. I mean, are you thinking about as prices go up, how much more it's going to cost the city?
Right. We'll actually probably create a set of scenarios that say, okay, if gasoline hits this price point, here's what you should be thinking about doing. If gasoline hits this next price point, here's what you should be thinking about doing. So the cities, basically, it's the recommendations will be recommendations in terms of strategies to address shortages or disruptions or price increases, but also scenarios. Well, yeah, basically scenarios for what they can do and gasoline prices are going to increase. I think that's a given.
They are increasing. I mean, it's
Right,
happening as we
right.
speak, so we know that's true. Are there any thoughts then in recommending things to the city for what they may do to better buffer themselves in that case over
we're
time?
still in the process of developing recommendations.
So
I'm not really
you're in the
prepared to talk
early
about that.
you're in the early stages for that. When do you report back to the?
We're aiming to have a report for the council in July.
Okay.
Right.
Including both aspects, the civic
Actually,
duty or as well as the population
I
of
think
large.
we're going to focus on creating a set of recommendations in July for the jurisdictional responsibilities.
Okay.
And then I think we'll sort of do a phase 2 after July and focus on community.
Because that's a
responsibilities.
massive task. It would
It's a lot of
seem to
work,
me.
yeah,
It would seem to me.
yeah.
What kinds of information are you getting? Some information from, I would imagine, the city and from PG&E, the electrical and gas supplier.
The city has, of course, records of what their energy utilization is, and we're looking at that.
Right.
And there's another factor that cities can, leverage, I think, which is their emergency preparedness, and there's, we're looking at that as well.
So does Sebastopol's emergency preparedness plans, because I know they have to have them for massive fire or earthquake or whatever,
Right.
does it have these kinds of shortages or rolling brownouts in that emergency plan at this time?
Not really,
Uh-huh.
but we're looking to ways we can sort of build on that to provide in terms of recommendations for the city.
Do you know of any other towns that are doing this?
Well, I think Willits is doing this.
Ah,
I'm not real
that kind
familiar
of big
with
assessment,
their.
we'll see.
Well, I think they're focused more on relocalization.
What do you mean by relocalization? Let's talk about
Okay.
what is relocalization.
Well, relocalization is it's a concept that I guess the concept refers to building the capacity of a community or a region to supply its own needs, right? I think that if there's a number of, I think, possible scenarios for how sort of the change in the energy supply could unfold, and one of the scenarios would be that it would be increasingly difficult to obtain food, water, some of the basic essentials that you would need for living, right? And so relocalization, I think, has to do with developing the capacity to create your own supply at a local level or a regional level.
It feels like a staggeringly daunting project, given the range of things that we live with in our modern world. I think all the way from computers and highly technical equipment to automobiles, which used to be made here.
People ask me what I think is going to happen. right?
Tell me what you
because
think. Tell me what you
well,
think will
I have
happen.
to admit, I've thought a lot about it, and I do scenario plannings, and I do strategic planning professionally, and so.
So this is going
This is
on in
what
your brain all the
This is what I
time.
think about a lot of the time when I'm driving to Sacramento, and I am actually an agnostic. I've come to the conclusion that I really don't know how it's going to unfold. I think and so for me, I think it's important to educate people about sort of what the driving forces are. And in this particular case, the driving forces are, that we've probably reached peak of production for oil, which means that at some point in the future, production will begin to decline. We're reaching probably the peak for natural gas, and in terms of electricity production, we're probably at the peak of capacity given the current infrastructure that exists. Now, what happens when the declines begin, I really don't know what's going to happen because, there's a lot of uncertainties that I don't really have a handle on. And one of the biggest uncertainties is human ingenuity.
Sure.
And the capacity that we have as a species to respond to adversity. Now, I think that the current sort of energy alternatives probably aren't scalable because the magic of oil is it's cheap.
Oh.
It's cheap
Yes.
energy,
Yes.
and the bang for the buck is amazing.
So so much energy in such a small
Right,
space,
right.
and it's portable, and
Right. All of those
sure.
things. It's like the miracle energy supply. As that ends, I think that human ingenuity will provide alternatives that I may not can conceive of. Right. Now, I don't know what that would look like. Therefore, I'm an agnostic. I also think that that the decline in peak will occur kind of incrementally. I don't think it's just going to be just a straight drop off a
So
cliff.
it's just.
I think there's probably going to be a bumpy plateau,
Okay.
and
we get used to that or whatever, and so start to get.
right. Now, to bring this back to relocalization, I think that the kinds of things that you would see that you might put in that relocalization basket will occur incrementally and occur in different areas in different ways, and so again, I just don't know how it will unfold. In peak, I don't know if you want to go into this, but there is, within the peak oil community, there is a perspective that I call the catastrophist.
Yes.
Perspective.
Yes, that it's all going to just crash, and we're
Right.
going to go over the cliff, and
Right.
the end of things.
And I find that it's not real useful to only focus on that as a possible scenario. I think you have to be aware of that as a possible scenario, but if that's where you put all your eggs, so to speak, I think you miss a lot of opportunities that are less dramatic. And so when I work with city governments and governmental officials, I tend not to go to the catastrophist perspective.
Because it's probably paralyzing. It's like if it's going to be all over, then
Right.
tomorrow we die, forget this whole thing.
Right.
But if there's something we can do, and maybe shape a different culture, we will have to be shaping a different culture, won't we? Because we don't know what's unfolding here for us.
Right. Well, this is probably the area I'm most interested in terms of peak oil and my work is how do you begin to move our culture in a different direction, right? I think one way you do is by working with government, because government does have the ability and the power to implement significant change. But there's also the power that each individual has to implement change in their own life. And ultimately, I think that's what has to happen, is individuals reshaping their own patterns of consumption and what satisfies them, and also in terms of solutions. And this is probably the part of relocalization I'm most interested in, is not so much the ability to grow your own food or creating local currencies or making your own shoes, but it has to do with the human capacity to share and to cooperate and to find joy and satisfaction in sharing and cooperating, because I think that ultimately what peak oil is about is there'll be one of the results or one of the outcomes is going to be a diminishing of the amount of the richness of the resources that our culture has had. We obviously, that the American culture uses more resources than any other culture.
Right.
And someday we're going to have to scale down. I think it's something I personally consider it a moral responsibility. And there's a simple living movement.
Sure,
and I think that's just the seeds of this. And someday we'll have to not just use less, but be satisfied with less and find happiness in other ways.
And so that gets us to when you talk about sharing. I mean, part of what cheap oil has fueled in this last 100 years is that kind of mobility. That disconnects us from wherever our family roots were, 100 years ago, and we can go anywhere and do anything. And as we've gotten maybe hyper individualized, maybe this brings us back round to needing one another, cooperating, and maybe some of that alienation that we talk about, that boredom that people have in our modern life.
I think what we can
come
learn
around
from looking at how the automobile and how cheap energy has shaped our culture, right? It's only been just 100 years. I think our culture could go in a completely different direction in 100 years.
Really?
Yeah. So
really?
I think that actually we could see a more communitarian culture emerge out of what I think is a coming energy crisis. And so I view this as actually an opportunity, not a potential for catastrophe, but a potential for the creation and an evolution of a new. It's not really even new, because I believe we're hardwired for sharing, right? Cooperation.
Sure.
So I think we have a great advantage. All we have to do is look at what we carry within us and sort of give that, recognize. If I say that I think that we can learn how to actually be satisfied with less and actually experience joy in sharing and cooperating, it's because I believe that that's how we're hardwired, and that's our genetic basis.
And we've gotten away from that.
We've
all
gotten
of
away
this
from that, right.
material affluence has sort of disconnected us from that satisfaction.
Right.
That's a really hopeful image to carry with us.
Right.
Do you see folks, in terms of the community education side of things, that Sebastopol and others want to do, as well as just the friends that you've connected with, your men's group, whatever? Are you finding people changing behavior yet, or just sort of starting to just get their minds around this possibility?
Well, Sebastopol is a unique place.
Well, they're ahead of all of the rest of everybody.
And as is Northern California, and I do believe that California, and in particular Northern California, does lead in this way. I think that the Bay Area is one of the culture creation centers of the world, and it's a magical place. And the influence from that goes all around the planet. And so I think that we have the potential to lead. In terms of your question, in terms of do I see it happening now, I think the answer is yes. I recognize it in my own self, and I recognize it in my friends, and ranging from, I know it's cliche to drive a Prius now, right? but that's one thing you can do. But I think more importantly, people are in Sebastopol value connecting with each other on a community basis. And there is satisfaction and joy in that. And so in some ways, we're less atomized, we're less individualistic, and
that's heartening. Your community, you have a stronger sense of community. So in our last few minutes here, any other thoughts you have on this whole area? Whether the businesses you're consulting with, are they starting to plan this in? What results do you find in other parts of our community beyond the civic, let's say, and personal?
It's just emerging. I am involved in a steering committee of people. We're putting on a conference in May for elected officials and their appointed staff. By appointed staff, I mean city managers, planning directors, those kinds of people, on energy vulnerability, and we're going to be bringing in some speakers to educate them. And I've also been working with some of the business leaders, in particular some of the regional business associations that, like the chambers of commerce and the North Bay Council is an example. They're a North Bay business organization, and they're beginning to recognize that this is an issue that needs to be on their radar screen.
Okay.
And so probably in the next year or two, you know, I'll be doing more work in the business arena. And I do this with my own clients. You know, when I do strategic planning, I always make sure that energy is on the radar screen and that they're planning for that.
So even though we may be waiting for, I mean, certainly one of the challenges here is, as the Hirsch report said a year ago, it takes, you know, 30, 20, 10 years to develop new infrastructures for a new energy source, which we may not have those 10, 20, 30 years. So I would imagine that business folk will have to be thinking about transportation certainly differently, or material stock.
Well, you see it first on Wall Street. You see it now. Wall Street is actually looking at peak oil as an opportunity, right, to invest in oil, but the futures, because those prices are going to go up.
Right.
I think that the investment firms like you know, pension funds are beginning to look at this as well. You know, I do think that Hirsch is probably correct in his assumption that it takes 10 to 20 years to move an economy away from cheap energy as its fundamental building block. I suspect we may experience some degree of turbulence probably in the next 10 years. I don't think it's just going to be smooth sailing into a future of alternative energy and happy cooperative people, right? And if history had told us anything, that people tend not to change unless they're in pain or suffering.
Yeah.
And so I believe that we will have to go through some period of turbulence that will get people's attention.
So I can imagine that communities like Sebastopol might be thinking about how to best help just their citizens travel through, be ready for, and be buffered to travel through that kind of new terrain, you know, that bumpy time.
That's certainly, I think, part of our charge, you know, especially working with on the sort of what the community responsibilities are.
It's going to be real interesting to hear the results of your.
Well, you should come back and visit.
Yeah, we will do that and see what you've come up with, because I think it's going to be a model for a lot of other communities. Thank you for this wonderful conversation, and good luck on the assessment that you're all doing for the community, and keep with it. Thanks. This is Peak Moment, and I'm Janaia Donaldson with my guest Matt Stevens from Sebastopol. Join us for our next episode of Peak Moment, Community Responses to a Changing Energy Future.